Hi there, how are you? I hope things are going well for you. And today I want to talk with you a bit about what's called the politics of identity. What happened in the United States in the 1960s? You might probably have said to yourself, the civil rights movement. There was a strange thing that happened. The belief that we were kind of all the same capital A Americans started to fall apart because there was a beginning of recognition that minority groups had very much less power and fewer opportunities than did dominant groups. And that has led to a whole big change, which you could see related to the civil rights movement in the 1960s. You could see with the Civil Rights Act, the American Indian movement, AIM, Feminist movement in the 1970s, and of course there was a long history of feminist movement before then, but really started to come to a head in a different way in the 1970s. And the gay rights movement related to the riots at Stonewall, this gay bar that existed in New York City. So a lot of minority groups in this particular period started to develop a strong sense of identity and started to question the relationships between themselves and power. What makes a minority group a minority? How does a dominant group create that structure and maintain that structure? So this is the concern in some ways of the three theorists at the end of Kenneth Allen's book. The first, Dorothy Smith, is a sociologist who was at Berkeley and was a lecturer in England. She received her Bachelor of Arts degree from the London School of Economics, and she was granted a PhD from the University of California at Berkeley. One notable fact making her different from many of the theorists we've discussed this semester, her husband left her with 2 children. And so you can imagine how that must have been for her to work as a full-time professor, having a career at a very powerful university, and also raising children, which I think might relate back to the type of work she did and what she thought about when conceptualizing sociology. She's very well known for what's called standpoint epistemology, which we'll talk about in a second. But she has what's called a theoretical method. As Kenneth Allen talks about, at one point she was praised and received a lot of attention for this book, The Everyday World as Problematic. And its subtitle, A Feminist Sociology. The journal Sociological Theory decided to honor Smith with an entire issue devoted to her. And she took issue with the idea that her work was theoretical. She said, no, it's not rooted in theory, it's rooted in method. Her idea is that there are individuals who are the subject of theory, and to some extent that denies their everyday lived experience of the world. And it, you could also argue, to some extent invalidates people's experience, because it says, here is what science and social science says is the truth, capital T truth. So Smith is problematizing the way that we think of ourselves as human beings through the lens of science. Here is a little bit that Smith says. It's not a totalizing theory. Rather, it's a method of inquiry, always ongoing, opening things up, discovering. Here's what Kenneth Allen says. It's a method grounded in a theoretical understanding of the world that results in theoretical insights. Smith is arguing that something happens when we formalize and generalize our concepts. we can quickly move out of the realm of real experience. Again, quoting Allen, standpoint theory isn't a theory per se. It's a method of observation that privileges the point of view of actual people over theoretical, abstract knowledge. So that gives you an idea of how she's grounding her work in the everyday lived experience of people, and in particular, women. And we'll talk more about that. But here, you'll see a little rephrase of what I just said. The male standpoint in particular in sociology and in science has not been recognized as a standpoint, okay? A standpoint means a subjective way of understanding something, right? So if you have a standpoint, you can see something, but you can only see it from that particular space. If you were omniscient, you could see everything. The thing about male knowledge is that it has been presented as if it is omniscient, as if it's all-knowing, rather than a particular standpoint. And so that's what she's saying here, that the knowledge that has been traditionally made by men is actually coming from a perspective. It's been seen as objective, neutral, unbiased, without particular interests. But Smith is saying that's just not true. Here's another line. She argues there currently is a, quote, conceptual distinction between the world as we experience it and the world as we know it through the conceptual frameworks that science invents. All right, a lot that's in that small series of words. There's a distinction between the world as we experience it, okay, our experience, and the world as we know it through this framework that science invents. So science is telling us that the world is a particular way, but that's not quite the same as our experience of it. So this is a very useful insight in that it says, what are we doing in science? And how does it actually work in relation to lived experience? Does it create a system where this information may dominate what people are doing in their lived experience and invalidate their lived experience? Okay? So this creates a fault line. And if you think of geology, a fault line is where one piece of land separates from another. It creates a fault line between the knowledge produced by science and that produced by women's experiences. So Dorothy Smith is interrogating science and seeing, really in some ways, the extent to which it isn't objective and neutral and doesn't correspond with the lived standpoint of women and other minority groups. Smith believes that subjective reality is the only way to know human behavior. We are each subjective beings. We cannot know how the world works in a complete objective way. So it's ridiculous to think we can. And she's making quite a good case to say that really the only experience that we have of the world is lived experience and subjective reality. So therefore, she's emphasizing looking at the standpoint of women as a way of understanding our world, and the way that this has been phrased for Smith here is feminist standpoint epistemology. So this is a way of knowing that emphasizes women's particular position in the world. She uses largely qualitative methods in order to understand women's lived experience. So things like interviewing, the recollection of work experience in some of her research, using archives, and also observation, participant observation. Again, qualitative methods that allow people to express themselves and show process and how people make meaning of their world. Also, her methodology is highly reflexive, a term that we've talked a little about before, but it means this idea of reflecting on itself. Uh, Her work involves a regular kind of analysis and revision of her own methods as a part of the process. It's an asking of yourself as a researcher, well, did I get this right? Am I pursuing the right questions? How might I adjust my methods, maybe if I find out new information, or my subjects seem not to think that I'm really understanding their lives? Smith has more recently engaged in what's called institutional ethnography. And here's something from Kenneth Allen. Institutional ethnography is like ethnomethodology and symbolic interactionism in that it focuses on how the practical actions of people in actual situations produce a meaningful social order. Okay? How those people in actual situations, in their practical actions, produce some type of meaningful social order. But there's a little bit more to it, because it adds the idea of marks and the idea of a system of domination and oppression. Okay? So it's how people in actual situations produce a meaningful order. But also, institutional ethnography examines the dialectical interplay, the back and forth interplay, between the relations of ruling, okay, the people who rule, as expressed and mediated through texts. Texts, for Smith, are written works. Okay? So ruling people create texts that allow for them to rule, that create the conditions of oppression. And the actual experiences of people as they negotiate and implement those texts. So Smith is looking at institutions creating texts, as well as the people, the lived experience of those people who are, if you will, sort of between, no, let me get that right. They are affected by the texts that the powerful create. And the texts are seen often as neutral or scientific, and she's critiquing the creation of these texts as neutral and scientific, and she's questioning whether or not they're meaningful if they're not based on real people's experiences. All right. So I just mentioned that phrase, relations of ruling. What does this mean? The idea of people who dominate in a society, you can think of, goes back to Marx. Okay, there are those who are in control of the means of production, the bourgeoisie, right? That was basic Marx. In this instance, Smith is saying that those people who are in power create texts that reflect their power, and those texts are considered to be the truth. All right. So as a social scientist, I am told, okay, if I do certain types of study using particular methods, then I will achieve a truth that's accepted by people. And the question is that text, that truth, really like the lived experience of people? Or has it been systematically removed from their experience and nothing at all like them? But they're told how they ought to match up with a particular way of thinking about them. So the example here is in social science. We turn people, real people, into populations, okay, that are counted and classified and controlled. So I am part of a system where people regularly do studies on homelessness, and they say, oh, homeless people, this percentage of homeless people are mentally ill, this percentage are substance abusers, this percentage lost their job, etc. And that removes, if you will, the idea of understanding homelessness from the very people experiencing the condition, right? And this is a huge point, because individuals then are encouraged to use this information to control their own subjectivity. So what happens is that people often say to themselves, well, okay, this study of the national economy has been conducted. Now, where do I fit in this study? How close am I to the average American? And it says we come to rely on data about the majority of people. We rely on self-help books. Dr. Phil apparently is supposed to know what he's doing when he analyzes people's relationships, and we think he knows that because he's done a lot of study and research. And we in turn then mold ourselves to those pictures of reality that are promoted by the dominant institutions through the text they create as capital T truth. Dorothy Smith also thinks that facts and texts, not commodification, produces alienation and objectification. And this means that she is taking some of the basic ideas, let's say, of Karl Marx, okay, that you can create alienation through a material system. You might remember Marx came up with different types of alienation, 4 different types of alienation that occur when someone is in a system which involves the production of goods and they can't control that production, okay? So people become alienated from their species being, the thing that makes them special as humans. They become alienated from other people. They become alienated from the product that they create. These types of things, they become alienated from themselves. So Smith says it isn't the idea of producing stuff that's involved with alienation. She's saying that facts and texts promote alienation and objectification. Just like I said in the previous slide, we look at studies about human beings and the social sciences to get kind of a measure on how we are as people. And those things are objectified, and they create an alienation in us. We are separate from the very things that purport to be analyses of us. And those things are used by powerful people, you could say, against us and to control us. Okay? So this is a new materialism. It's beyond the materialism that Marx looked at and his ideas of alienation. Smith conducted research on the family and schools and would go to schools and to families and talk to those individuals. And that is remarkable to some extent for a sociologist. Many sociologists might go and talk with people, but sometimes going in with their own agenda of how they think things are. They have a hypothesis they want to test. And Smith is really, as I said earlier, reflexive as to what the group tells her, what the individuals tell her, and asking them if she's got it right. So it's a new way of doing things that is actually very, very contemporary. What she found in some of her research is a lack of interest in issues concerning girls and women in schooling. In 2 different bullet points I have here, universities and colleges have incorporated successful programs, but she found that public schools really haven't. And she would like to see changes that allow girls to have a larger say in school dynamics. So she's interested in finding out just how the relations of ruling pervade the lives of women. And also the relations of ruling can as well be misrecognized by women. Sometimes women accept those as normal and legitimate. So again, she wants to make visible the relations of ruling, how they impact women, and for that matter, men. How is it that this system gets created that separates itself, its object of knowledge, from the very source of knowledge? Our next theorist, Patricia Hill Collins, She received her Bachelor of Arts degree from Brandeis, master's from Harvard, and then went back to Brandeis for her PhD. And she is a distinguished professor of sociology at the University of Cincinnati. You'll begin to see there are some similarities between Patricia Hill Collins and Dorothy Smith. One of them is that idea of the importance of marginal people, outsiders, to understanding relations of power. I once had a professor who said that the people who understand power the best are the oppressed people, the people who have the least power. And if you really think about that, it makes a lot of sense, because people who have power don't reflect on their power. It's the people who are affected by those relationships that really understand. They understand, oh, let's say if I'm an administrative assistant, oh, if I act this way in front of my boss will get angry. Oh, I need to do this. Oh, my desk is a desk that everyone can reach across and touch, whereas the boss's desk is separate and kept apart, and no one would even dare enter the boss's office unless the boss says so. So the people who are oppressed understand power the best. And feminist theory argues that the focus of sociological theory should be outsider groups, especially those who lack a voice. Okay? So there are many, many people who are the subject of sociology, studied by sociology. But this is a question that Smith asks: how much of this sociology is really about the people who are being studied? Do they even have a voice? Because, again, you have to think carefully. How do powerful people end up representing those with less power through some type of institutionalized structure that legitimates the powerful people as knowing, as smart, as understanding, and maybe even the people who have a voice as not understanding their own situations? So feminist methods argue for using subjective analysis of concrete experiences. Subjective analysis means how someone understands their concrete experience. In the past, theory and sociology focused largely on white male interests. Okay? They were the focus of attention, and also they were the people who focused and directed research. So there are problems, and these are the kinds of things, as I mentioned at the beginning of the slides, that when the 60s started to come around, this recognition that in fact, the world had many people in it who did not experience democracy in the United States in the same way, who were oppressed, who didn't have the opportunities. So Collins argues science has been rooted in Eurocentric positivism. We've talked about positivism before. It's the idea that you can use the methods of the natural sciences to study people in the social sciences. So Eurocentric positivism, okay? And that, if you will, is like Smith's idea, because Eurocentric positivism promotes the separation of the knower from the known. So it's saying again that there can be this knower from on high who studies things, instead of the knower being exactly a part of the things that he or she studies. All right? And this also promotes the idea that research is objective, that we can somehow stand outside of social situations and understand them in their complete and complex fullness. And again, too, that ideas are dissociated from those who create them. Institutions, for Smith, create bodies of knowledge that are then separated and anonymous from the people who create them, from the bureaucrats. Collins is making a very, very similar point here, that what comes to be thought of as truth becomes the product of this invisible collection of scientists. So what Collins focuses on is epistemology. And epistemology, I'd like you to know, it's an important term. It's the study of knowledge. In real simple terms, epistemology is how do we know what we know? Eurocentric positivism, we talked about what positivism means. Eurocentric, of course, is this idea that Europe, Western Europe, should be thought of as the best culture, the culture by which to judge all other cultures. And we are a very Eurocentric society, as I've mentioned before. The idea is that the best philosophers, the best composers, the best literature, this belief that it all comes from Western Europe, that's Eurocentrism. So Collins is arguing that black feminist epistemology is an alternative to this type of thinking, and it has 4 characteristics. First of all, it's built on lived experience. So, drawing again from Kenneth Allen, it's only those men and women who experience the consequences of living under an oppressed social position who can select, and this is Collins quoted here, topics for investigation and methodologies used. So again, oppression is a key for those people who are oppressed to be able to say, oh look, this is how power works. They are knowers. Okay, so it's built on lived experience. Second, it uses dialogue and not adversarial debate. So the real goal here is to try to understand things as opposed to win an argument. And that means that, or it also implies that there are multiple subjects trying to understand something, people who have different perspectives. So knowledge ongoingly emerges through dialogue. That's what Kenneth Allen says. Alternative epistemologies tend to see the world, tend to use personal pronouns such as I and we instead of objectifying and distancing languages as found in social science. So you might remember that actually connects back to the style of writing we talked about in W.E.B. Du Bois's work. Okay. 3, black feminist epistemology promotes knowledge built around an ethics of caring. And this is a very nice idea. It says here that Collins argues all knowledge is intrinsically value-laden and thus should be tested by the presence of empathy and compassion. She's saying, what is the goal of social science? It has to be empathy. It has to be humane and good for people. So that says that we need to not have a separate idea of knowledge apart from studying people. It should be employed to helping people. And that requires personal accountability, the 4th point. So personal accountability means that you as the knower are accountable for your study, for what you say. It means that you are morally and ethically accountable for the type of research you do. And that is, I think, a very important addition, more recent addition, sadly, to a lot of our contemporary research. Collins, therefore, you could see from the information above, believes that emotional concepts are important. And she argues that individuals have their own reality constructs that are linked to the groups to which they belong. So there can be a black feminist epistemology, okay? A unique way of knowing for black women, different from, say, for example, Chicana women. Different again, perhaps, from the knowledge of gay men, okay? So individuals and the groups they're in construct their own reality. And why shouldn't social science look at that and understand that? There's a phrase called the matrix of domination, and that is discussed here, to quote Allen again. It refers to the overall organization of power in a society, okay? And that means there are intersecting systems of oppression. So matrix, if you think of a matrix, it's like kind of a woven structure, many different parts working together. And a matrix of domination means that domination and oppression comes to happen through many different elements and forms. So it's, again, referring to the organization of power in a society with intersecting forms of oppression. And Collins argues that these have 4 specific domains. The first one is structural, all right? And that means social organizations that create some forms of domination. Second are disciplinary structures, and those come through bureaucracies in society. Hegemonic ideas are when people believe in and accept authority. So something is hegemonic if we just accept it to be true. Like many people might say, for example, it's just natural that we own private property, that human beings own property. Well, that's a hegemonic statement. It assumes a certain type of reality to be true. And so that means that you accept a certain type of authority. Well, the people who have goods, who have property, then that's natural that they have that. It isn't natural for it to be, say, redistributed. And then the fourth domain, interpersonal, the interpersonal domain, everyday life and routines. That's also a place where you see sometimes systems of oppression working. And so for Collins, she makes this great point. If you're going to be an activist, if you're going to try for social equality, social justice, you have to work across all 4 of those fronts to achieve it. Some of the material I draw from in this slide has been re-edited by me, but it originally comes from Melanie Lord, Anthony Grieder, and Zuflo Tosnor. These are the 3 authors of the outline that I'm working from here, with some edits that I have included. The idea with black feminism, it has 3 key themes. One of these is the idea of self-definition and self-valuation. And that means that a group defines itself. So self-definition is a key to empowerment. Who are we, right? If we define ourselves, then that's key to empowerment. That gives us our identity. And self-valuation, the second bullet point, stresses the content of black women's self-definitions and valuing those self-definitions. So the group creates its own sense of value based on feeling that its own self-definitions are good and true and valuable. The second theme in black feminism, there's again this kind of interlocking nature of oppression, the matrix of domination we talked about before. Gender, race, and class are interconnected, and these systems of domination crisscross. So gender, race, class, you can think of each one as its own system of domination, but that they can work together to create, in some instances, people who are more excluded than perhaps others. And that means that what we ought to do is what's called intersectionality. This is an idea that's particularly connected with Patricia Hill Collins. Here's a couple more points. Society has attempted to teach black women that racism, sexism, and poverty are inevitable, that that's just how it is. Okay, so that means that intersectionality If you study that, you start to unpack how black women are specifically affected by certain forms of oppression, maybe differently than white women. And those forms of oppression work to keep black women oppressed. That's captured in this other bullet point at the bottom. Awareness of this situation is going to help black women to unite together to fight against oppression and discrimination. The third theme in black feminism, the importance of African American women's culture. Now, what's culture? Culture is really anything human beings produce. Okay? It includes our language, thought, values, norms, ideas. It involves every material object that human beings have created or used. So culture is a very broad topic. But it's saying that this is valuable. African Americans and African American women have a culture that's valuable. So this involves efforts to redefine and explain the importance of this culture. And that has uncovered new black female experience. As black women have come together to talk and share, they're able to say, hey, we have these things in common. And these experiences are not just my experiences. There's a pattern to them. They repeat, and I understand, and in a real sense, what you are going through. So another aspect of this culture is it identified social relations where Afro-American women are able to pass on the essentials for coping with oppression. So it's not just the experience of African American women as a minority group, but also how do they embody that oppression and pass on coping mechanisms to each other. Because another element of culture is passed on from one group to another, from one generation to another. What's been the sociological significance of black feminism? Well, the content of ideas in sociology, okay, the main ideas within sociology and what counts as sociology, has been influenced by an ongoing dialogue between black feminists and sociological societies, like, for example, the ASA, the American Sociological Association. So black feminists have dialogued with the American Sociological Association to say, well, what counts as sociology? How can we also be seen as contributing to this? Our experiences and viewpoints are important. So this has broadened the range of what counts as sociology. Also, what's important to think about, for Collins, black women are not a homogeneous group, okay? There are many different black women with many different kinds of experiences in places in the world, places all over the United States, and those experiences and ways of being are going to be different. There's variety, of course, within this collective. But they do, for Collins, experience a collective standpoint, right? There's a general idea of black feminist thought and black women's experiences in the world. You can see some patterns, and black women share that with each other. Collins argues that they need safe spaces in order to share their experiences, though. People aren't going to share things unless they feel comfortable sharing them. And so Collins identifies 3 such safe spaces. One is in women's relationships to each other, that when black women get together, either in pairs or in small groups, they can feel comfortable sharing their experiences and thus saying, oh, I know what you mean, or I know what you're going through. They can relate in that way. Also, Collins says through blues music that women, black women, can understand the experience of other black women. And finally, black women can understand their experience and other black women through black women authors, such as Maya Angelou. So these are sources for black women to feel a sense of togetherness, a sense of shared experience and this idea that I'm not alone in seeing some of these oppressive type things, and being able to look to texts like music, women authors, to validate those experiences as well. Some closing points. Black feminist intellectuals are intermediaries between their own and their peers' experience, but they're also intellectuals concerned with social justice. So they are intellectuals, academics, who are also black women, and they're concerned at the same time with social justice. Collins is concerned that their ideas, their intellectual work can be easily co-opted, and they can potentially lose connections to their roots. So if you think about it, that parallels Dorothy Smith's idea that really these black intellectual women have a privileged position and they ought to fight for social justice for themselves, their peers, the category of black women generally, but also that through a system where certain kinds of truths are privileged, their truths can be validated without getting feedback back from everyday black women. So this is the point that Collins is making, that intellectuals have to be on guard, that they don't have their information reified or made as objects. They're in a continual dialogue with the very people who they're studying and who they actually are a part of. As I said before, I borrowed some of that above outline from Melanie Lord, Anthony Grieder, and Zuflo Trsnovic, and there's the webpage if you'd like to look at it. The last intellectual that Kenneth Allen considers is Cornel West. And Cornel West received his PhD from Princeton. He was a professor at Harvard, and he's back at Princeton, and he became professor at Union Theological Seminary recently. He has written several books, and what's interesting about Cornel West is he appears in a lot of different kinds of media projects. So he's been on CDs with rappers, and he's been in movies such as The Matrix. West's theory is derived from, and it's also blending elements of pragmatism, which we talked about before. It's related to the work of John Dewey, Henry James, and directly connected with that social theorist we looked at a while back, George Herbert Mead. Existentialism is questioning the meaning of existence. It's found in works by Jean-Paul Sartre, the philosopher. And also, West thinks about and draws from Christianity. So ideas that come from the Judeo-Christian tradition found in the Old Testament and the New Testament. Basically, you have these terms here, market dynamics and market saturation. Let me give you a little background on those. Okay, as I said before, since the 1960s, blacks in the United States have enjoyed increased freedoms, like political freedom, economic freedom, through things like the civil rights movement. However, they've also become victims of what you could call as market saturation, which means basically the idea that commodities have saturated our lives. Advertising has saturated our lives. We are bombarded with messages that say the key route to happiness is through buying stuff. Okay, that is market saturation. And West is arguing that this market saturation stripped away community-based values from the black community, and it substituted market moralities. So it was taking away an orientation that blacks had before towards civic and religious institutions, ties of the family, and that there is a move now in the black community toward hedonistic pleasure and monetary gain, according to Cornel West. He's also saying that the effects of the market is exaggerated for blacks. According to Kenneth Allen, it says because of the heritage of African Americans, a mix of past wounds, including slavery, continued racial prejudice, and market moralities altogether create what's called black nihilism. And nihilism means nothingness. So this experience of blacks in the United States and their oppression creates a sense of anger. But the nihilism means that the anger isn't turned toward the things causing the oppression. The anger is turned inward. So West is saying that this, black nihilism, is a serious problem for African Americans that's promoting self-hatred. He's also concerned with what he calls the black leadership crisis. And this is about the types of leaders that emerge from the black community. He says that there are three general leadership styles with black politicians and academics. The first are race-effacing managerial elitists. Okay, race-effacing means that they are not really designated by race. He says that this is a type of leader that's growing rapidly in the US, and the idea is they're trying to fit in rather than stand out because of their racial characteristics, their minority group-based characteristics. This is a type of person dominated by bureaucratic norms and really, as I said before, not putting forward their racial identity. The other two types of leaders in West's formulation of the black leadership crisis are those who strongly identify with their race and are protest leaders. So he says these are individuals who are capitalizing on their race, their minority group status, but they're doing so in a very limited way. And this shows itself through a concern with black turf for West and protecting, emphasizing racial reasoning, and that's below. We'll talk more about that. The third type of black leader is the race-transcending prophetic leader, which is, again, transcending their racial status, and it emphasizes this notion of moral reasoning as opposed to racial reasoning. Let's consider what each of those means. Racial reasoning is concerned with equality as a group right rather than as a social issue. So, like Patricia Hill Collins, West is saying that there is a black experience, and that denies the differences within the black community. So the idea here that there's a black experience, a unified black experience, homogeneous, denies differences. And what it does, West says, is it encourages a kind of a conservatism, which promotes political cynicism. It says that we have this experience of oppression, and really things cannot be changed. And that is debilitating, according to West. Moral reasoning is this idea of really probably what West prefers. It's transcending the idea of race, and prophetic leaders are emphasizing this. So prophetic means, prophecy, prophesizing. So forward-thinking leaders for West. And he's saying moral reasoning isn't about racial identification. It's not dividing black people. And it's also rejecting other things that are oppressive conditions, like patriarchy and homophobia. So West is looking forward to leaders who engage in moral reasoning as a basis for social justice for all peoples.